The evening sun was setting over the bustling city streets, casting long shadows between the towering buildings. On the corner of Fifth Avenue, where the sweet smell of roasted nuts mixed with the aroma of coffee, the night grew colder as autumn's chill crept through the city streets. The young mother noticed her daughter shivering in the stroller, despite the extra blanket wrapped around her tiny frame. Pressing her hand against her child's forehead, she felt the heat radiating from her skin. Her heart sank. Her little girl was burning up with fever. The regular crowd of evening commuters had thinned out, leaving behind empty sidewalks and the occasional scatter of fallen leaves. The mother's voice, usually strong and clear, trembled slightly as she began singing Ave Maria. It was her daughter's favorite lullaby, the one that always seemed to soothe her fears and chase away her bad dreams. But tonight, even the familiar melody couldn't ease her growing worry. She paused between verses to count the day's earnings. $3.47 clinked sadly in her paper cup. The pharmacy on the corner had children's medicine for $12.99, and they still needed something for dinner. Her throat tightened as she looked at her sleeping child, whose usual rosy cheeks were now flushed with fever. An older woman who ran the nearby flower shop had been watching them all afternoon. She approached with a steaming cup of tea, pressing it into the mother's cold hands. "For your throat," she said kindly, before heading back to close her shop. The warmth of the cup matched the warmth of the gesture, bringing tears to the young mother's eyes. As she sipped the tea, memories flooded back. Memories of nursing her husband through his final days, watching helplessly as illness took him away. The thought of her daughter being sick, even with just a fever, sent waves of fear through her heart. She couldn't lose her too. She wouldn't. Her voice rose again, this time carrying a different kind of emotion. People who passed by could hear it. The love, the fear, the determination of a mother fighting for her child. The song wasn't just music anymore. It was a prayer, a plea, a promise to keep going no matter what. The evening grew darker, and the street lights flickered on one by one. Her daughter stirred in the stroller, whimpering softly in her feverish sleep. The mother tucked the blanket tighter around her, wishing she could do more. She had tried the shelters earlier, but they were all full. "Just hold on, baby," she whispered. "Mommy's going to figure something out." She started another song, one she used to perform in her college recitals. The notes echoed off the tall buildings, carrying her voice further than before. A few late-night workers stopped to listen, drawn by the raw emotion in her performance. One dropped $1 in her cup, another left a granola bar. Small kindnesses that meant the world. The traffic light at the corner turned red, and a line of cars stopped. Among them was a sleek black luxury car, its window slightly open. The mother continued singing, unaware that inside that car, someone was listening intently to every note. She was focused only on her daughter, on the medicine they needed, on surviving another night. Her voice soared into the darkness, carrying hope and desperation in equal measure. Sometimes life's biggest changes come when we least expect them. And tonight, though she didn't know it yet, everything was about to change. The black luxury car had been sitting at the red light for nearly 10 minutes now, caught in the evening traffic jam. Inside, a well-dressed man in his 50s sat in the back seat, his phone call forgotten, as he listened to the voice floating through his partially opened window. In 30 years of producing music, he had learned to recognize something special when he heard it. The mother's voice carried the kind of emotion that couldn't be taught in any music school. It was raw, pure, and touched something deep in the soul. The producer found himself closing his eyes, remembering the first time he heard his grandmother sing in their old kitchen back home. This voice had that same quality, the ability to make you feel something real. His driver cleared his throat. "Sir, the traffic's moving. We're already late for the dinner meeting." But the producer held up his hand, signaling him to wait. The young woman had started a new song, an old Italian aria that he knew well. Her technique was flawless, but it was more than that. She sang as if her life depended on it. And from what he could see through the window, Maybe it did. The little girl in the stroller stirred, coughing softly. The mother immediately stopped singing, reaching down to touch her daughter's forehead. The worry on her face was clear even from the car. The producer watched as she checked the paper cup beside her, counting what little money was there. The scene struck something in his heart. He had a daughter too, though she was grown now with children of her own. "Pull over," he told his driver. The car eased to the curb, its expensive tires crunching on scattered autumn leaves. The mother's voice faltered for a moment as the car stopped, uncertainty crossing her face. She had learned to be cautious of fancy cars and well-dressed strangers. The producer stepped out, feeling the cold evening air bite through his expensive coat. Up close, he could see that the mother's coat was thin and worn, but clean and carefully mended. Her daughter's stroller, though old, was neatly organized with their few belongings. These weren't people looking for an easy handout. This was someone fighting to keep her dignity and protect her child. "Please," he said softly, "don't stop singing." He stood there, giving her space, showing her he meant no harm. After a moment's hesitation, she began again, her voice carrying the same song she had been singing when he first heard her. Up close, it was even more impressive. Her control, her range, her ability to convey emotion, it was all there. Other people started gathering too. A couple stopped their evening walk to listen. A teenager took out his earbuds. A tired-looking waitress paused on her way to work. For a moment, this small patch of busy city sidewalk became something else. A place where beauty could still surprise you, where hope could find you when you least expected it. The producer noticed how the mother kept one hand on her daughter's stroller while she sang, as if afraid someone might try to take away the last precious thing she had left in the world. Her voice told a story of loss, of love, of refusing to give up, even when life had taken almost everything. When she finished the song, the small crowd burst into applause. The mother blushed, not used to such attention. The producer stepped forward, reaching for his wallet. But he knew this wasn't about just leaving some money in a cup. He had heard something rare tonight, something special. And he had the power to do more than just walk away. As the producer stepped closer, the young mother instinctively pulled her daughter's stroller behind her. She had learned the hard way that kindness sometimes came with strings attached. The small crowd that had gathered began to drift away, leaving them in an awkward bubble of silence broken only by the usual city noise. "Your technique," the producer said softly, keeping his distance, "it's classically trained, isn't it?" He noticed how she stood, shoulders back, chin slightly raised despite her circumstances. It was the posture of someone who had spent years in music schools. "I studied at the conservatory," she replied cautiously, one hand still resting protectively on the stroller. Before, she glanced down at her daughter, her voice trailing off. Some stories were too painful to tell to strangers, even well-dressed ones who seemed kind. Her little girl coughed again, and this time the producer could hear the congestion in her chest. He watched as the mother quickly knelt down, feeling her daughter's forehead again with worried eyes. The child's face was flushed with fever, her breaths coming in small, wheezy puffs. "She needs medicine," he said. It wasn't a question. The mother nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on her daughter. The producer could see her mental calculations, the empty cup, the late hour, the closed shelters. He had daughters of his own. He knew that look of parental helplessness. "I don't usually do this," he began, reaching into his coat. The mother tensed, but he slowly pulled out his business card. Under the streetlight, its gold lettering caught the light. Global Music Productions. Her eyes widened slightly. Even on the streets, she has stayed connected enough to the music world to recognize the name. 10 years ago, he continued, I walked past a street performer in Seoul. I kept walking. Found out later, she became one of the biggest stars in Asia. He smiled sadly. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. The mother picked up the business card with trembling fingers. The paper was thick, expensive. Real. Her daughter stirred in the stroller, whimpering softly in her fever-induced sleep. The producer watched as she tucked the card carefully into her coat pocket. "There's a 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks from here," he said, pulling out his wallet. This time, she didn't flinch. He counted out enough for medicine and a proper meal, maybe even a cheap hotel room for the night. "Tomorrow morning, if you want, my studio is on 42nd Street. We could do a proper audition." The mother looked at the money, then at her daughter, then back at the producer. Years of disappointment had taught her to be wary of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. But years of being a mother had also taught her that sometimes you had to take a chance for your child. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help us?" The producer smiled, and for a moment, she could see the young musician he must have been before he became a successful businessman. "Because," he said simply, "real talent deserves a chance. And real music," he gestured to her daughter, "comes from living a real life." Back in the shelter that night, after getting medicine for her daughter at the pharmacy, the mother sat on the edge of their narrow bed. The business card felt heavy in her pocket, like it carried the weight of all her old dreams. Her little girl was finally sleeping peacefully, the fever reducer doing its job. The shelter's dim lights cast long shadows across the room, where other families were settling in for the night. She pulled out her phone, an old model she kept charged at the library during the day. It was her last connection to her past life, kept running on a minimal prepaid plan so potential employers could reach her. With shaking fingers, she typed the producer's name into the search bar, using the shelter's weak Wi-Fi signal. The results made her heart skip a beat. There he was, photos at music award shows, articles about platinum records, interviews about discovering new talent. The company was real. His success was real. But experience had taught her that reality could be just as dangerous as deception. She remembered another night years ago when she had held another piece of paper that promised a future. It was her acceptance letter to the conservatory, complete with a scholarship. Back then, she had been so sure about where life would take her. Now, sitting on a shelter bed watching her sick child sleep, nothing felt certain anymore. A woman in the next bed overnoticed her troubled expression. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked softly, careful not to wake the other sleeping families. The mother showed her the business card, explained what had happened. The woman listened, nodding slowly. Sometimes, the older woman said, folding her laundry with careful movements, "The good things in life are just as real as the bad ones. We just forget to trust them because the bad ones hurt us so much." The mother looked at her daughter again. The child's breathing had eased, her face peaceful now that the fever was breaking. They had been on the streets for 3 months, ever since the medical bills had taken everything. 3 months of singing on corners, of shelter beds when they were lucky, of never knowing where their next meal would come from. She thought about her husband, about how he had always believed in her voice. "You'll sing on big stages someday," he used to say. Even in his final days in the hospital, he had asked her to sing for him. What would he want her to do now? Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone again. This time, she looked up directions to the studio address on the card. It was a real place in a busy part of town. If things felt wrong, she could always leave. She had gotten good at knowing when to walk away. Her daughter stirred slightly, hugging her worn teddy bear closer. The mother reached out to stroke her hair, feeling the normal temperature of her forehead with relief. The producer's words echoed in her mind. Real music comes from living a real life. Well, she had certainly lived a real life, especially these past few months. Looking at the few dollars she had left from what the producer had given her, she made a decision. They could take the morning bus to the studio. Just to see. Just to try. After all, she thought with a small smile, they had nothing left to lose, and maybe, just maybe, everything to gain. Morning sunlight streamed through the shelter windows as the mother packed their few belongings into the stroller. Her daughter was feeling better, chattering happily about the banana a shelter volunteer had given her for breakfast. The fever had broken during the night, leaving behind only a slight sniffle and rosy cheeks. The mother's hands trembled as she dialed the number on the business card. Each ring made her heart beat faster. What if no one answered? What if yesterday had been just a dream? But after 3 rings, a friendly receptionist picked up. When she mentioned the producer's name, there was an immediate change in tone. "Oh yes, he left specific instructions. A car will pick you up in 30 minutes. Where should we send it?" The mother froze. A car. She hadn't expected that. For a moment, doubt crept back in. But then she looked at her daughter, happily hugging her teddy bear, and thought about another day of singing on cold street corners. Taking a deep breath, she gave the shelter's address. While they waited outside, her daughter spun in circles on the sidewalk, feeling well enough to dance again. The mother had washed their faces in the shelter's bathroom, combed their hair as neatly as she could. She had even used a safety pin to fix a small tear in her coat. It wasn't much, but it helped her feel more prepared for whatever was coming. The car that pulled up wasn't the fancy black one from yesterday. Instead, it was a simple silver sedan with a kind-faced female driver who introduced herself as the producer's assistant. The mother relaxed slightly. This felt less intimidating, more real somehow. "We need to make a quick stop first," the assistant said as she helped them load the stroller into the trunk. She pulled into a small parking lot a few blocks away. "The boss thought your little one might be hungry." The assistant handed them a paper bag filled with still warm breakfast sandwiches and a small carton of orange juice. As they drove through the city, the mother watched the familiar streets pass by. These were the same streets where she had been singing just yesterday, but today it looked different somehow. Her daughter sat beside her, carefully eating her sandwich, legs swinging happily. The studio building wasn't as fancy as she had imagined. It was an old brick building with music posters in the windows and a small sign above the door. But when they stepped inside, she could hear music everywhere, floating down hallways, seeping through walls, filling the air with possibility. The receptionist smiled warmly when they walked in, immediately offering the little girl a coloring book and crayons. "He's finishing up a meeting," she said. "Make yourselves comfortable." The waiting area had comfortable chairs and walls covered in gold and platinum records. The mother recognized some of the names, artists whose songs she used to sing on street corners. Her daughter settled on the floor with her coloring book, humming softly to herself. A young man carrying a guitar case passed through, then stopped and backed up. "Hey, aren't you the one who sings on Fifth Avenue? Your version of Ave Maria made me cry last week." The mother nodded, surprised to be recognized. The guitarist grinned. "Welcome to the family," he said, before disappearing down the hallway. Sitting there, watching her daughter color, listening to the distant sounds of music and creativity, the mother felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate kind that helped her survive day to day, but the real kind that whispered of better days ahead. The recording studio was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of cold and formal, it felt warm and lived in, with worn leather chairs and walls covered in old concert posters. The producer led them into a small room with a piano in one corner and microphones set up near the center. "Just think of it as another street corner," he said kindly, noticing her nervous glance at the equipment. "Except this time, you're not singing to survive. You're singing because it's what you were born to do." Her daughter sat contentedly on a plush couch near the back of the room, still working in her coloring book. The producer's assistant had brought her apple juice and cookies, making the little girl feel like a princess in her own fairy tale. "What would you like to sing?" the producer asked, settling into a chair behind a small mixing board. The mother thought for a moment, then smiled. She knew exactly what to sing, the lullaby she had performed for her husband in his final days, the one that always made their daughter smile. As the first notes left her lips, something magical happened. Her voice, no longer fighting against street noise and winter winds, filled the room with pure, crystal-clear emotion. The producer closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Through the control room window, she could see other studio staff stopping their work, drawn by the sound. Halfway through the song, she noticed her daughter had stopped coloring. The little girl was watching her mother with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. Perhaps she had never heard her mother's voice like this, free from worry and strain, singing not for coins, but for the pure joy of it. A young sound engineer wiped tears from her eyes. Another producer poked his head in, then stayed to listen. The cleaning lady paused in the hallway, her mop forgotten in her hands. The mother kept singing, pouring everything into the music, her love for her daughter, her memories of her husband, the struggles of the past months, and now, this glimpse of hope. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then her daughter started clapping excitedly, and everyone joined in. The producer had a look in his eyes that she recognized from her conservatory days, the look of someone who knew they had just witnessed something special. That was, he started, then shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. Would you like to try another? She nodded, feeling more confident now. This time, she chose an old Italian aria, one she used to practice in her college days. As she sang, more people gathered outside the studio. Someone started recording on their phone. Her voice soared through the complex melodic runs, hitting each note perfectly. Years of classical training merged with months of raw emotion from the streets, creating something entirely new. This wasn't just technique. This was life itself transformed into music. By the time she finished the second song, the small studio was packed. The producer's assistant had tears streaming down her face. A famous rapper who had been recording down the hall stood in the doorway, nodding appreciatively. Her daughter had fallen asleep on the couch, a peaceful smile on her face. The producer pressed a button on his intercom. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," he said simply. "We've got work to do." The producer's office felt warm and welcoming, with afternoon sunlight streaming through large windows. Family photos lined his desk, showing him with his own children over the years. The mother sat nervously in a comfortable chair, while her daughter played quietly with some toys the receptionist had given her. "What I'm about to offer you," the producer said, sliding a folder across his desk, "isn't just a recording contract. It's a fresh start." He opened the folder, revealing papers filled with legal terms she barely understood. But what caught her eye wasn't the contract. It was a separate document about housing assistance. "I don't understand," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. The producer leaned back in his chair, looking at a photo of his own daughter on his desk. 25 years ago," he said, "my wife and I nearly lost everything. Someone gave us a chance when we needed it most." He smiled at her daughter, who was making her teddy bear dance in the corner. "Talent needs nurturing. That means taking care of the whole person, not just the voice." The housing assistance paper detailed a small but clean apartment near the studio. The rent would be deducted from her future earnings, but at a rate she could afford. There was even a provision for childcare during recording sessions. "But what if—" she started, her voice trembling. The producer held up his hand. "What if you're not successful? What if the album doesn't sell?" He shook his head. "That's not what this is about. I heard something special in your voice that night. Something real. Whether it sells millions or just a few copies, that voice deserves to be heard." Her daughter wandered over, climbing into her lap. The producer watched as she automatically adjusted her arms to hold her child, never missing a beat in their conversation. It was the instinct of a mother who had kept her child safe through the worst of times. "The contract is for 2 years," he continued. "Standard terms, but with some extras. Health insurance for both of you. A small advance to get you started. And—" he pulled out another paper. "I took the liberty of contacting your old conservatory. They're interested in having you finish your degree if you want. We can work recording sessions around your classes." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at the papers. It wasn't just a contract. It was everything she had prayed for during those long nights in the shelter. A chance not just to survive, but to live again. To give her daughter the life they had lost. The producer stood up and walked to his office door. Take some time. Read everything carefully. But know this, that apartment is yours starting tonight, contract or no contract. No one should have to sing in the cold. Left alone in the office with her daughter, she held the papers with trembling hands. Her little girl looked up at her with curious eyes. "Mommy, are you crying?" "Happy tears, baby," she whispered, hugging her daughter close. Happy tears. Through the office window, she could see the city stretching out before her. The same city that had been so cruel now seemed to offer endless possibilities. Somewhere out there was their old street corner, but she knew she wouldn't be going back. Sometimes life's hardest moments lead to its greatest blessings. The producer's words echoed in her mind. Talent needs nurturing. But maybe, she thought, looking at her daughter's smiling face, it wasn't just talent that needed nurturing. Sometimes hope needed nurturing too. And today, hope was blooming like flowers after a long winter. 3 months later, the mother stood backstage at the city's largest charity concert hall, her heart pounding with anticipation. Her fingers traced the soft fabric of her new dress. Nothing fancy, but clean and professional. Down the hallway, she could hear her daughter giggling with the event coordinator's children, all of them dressed up for the special night. This wasn't just any performance. Tonight's charity event was raising money for homeless families, the same ones she had shared shelter spaces with not so long ago. The same ones who had shared their food with her daughter, who had watched her belongings while she looked for work, who had given her hope when she had none. Through the curtain, she could see the hall filling up. The producer had kept his word about everything. They now had a small but comfortable apartment, just 10 minutes from her daughter's new preschool. The advance from her recording contract had helped her pay off the medical bills that had bankrupted them after her husband's death. But more importantly, the studio had become like family. Her daughter was thriving. The little girl who had once slept in a stroller on cold streets now had a real bed, regular meals, and a group of studio staff who doted on her like favorite aunts and uncles. She still carried her old teddy bear everywhere, but now it was joined by new friends, gifts from people who had heard their story and been touched by it. The producer appeared beside her, looking proud but nervous, almost as nervous as she felt. "Full house out there," he said softly. "And guess who's in the front row? The shelter coordinator and half the families from your old shelter. We sent a bus to bring them." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back carefully, protecting her stage makeup. Her daughter ran up to hug her, wearing a pretty blue dress that matched her mother's. "Look what I made you, Mommy." She held up a slightly crumpled paper heart, decorated with crayon drawings of music notes. The stage manager gave the 5-minute signal. The mother knelt down to her daughter's level, just like she used to do on those street corners, ready to watch Mommy sing. The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "Just like old times?" she asked. Her daughter shook her head. "No, Mommy. Better than old times." As she walked onto the stage, the lights felt warm on her face. The audience applauded, but she barely heard them. Instead, she heard the echo of coins dropping in a paper cup, of kind words from strangers, of her husband's voice telling her to never give up on her dreams. The music started, and she began to sing. This time, her voice carried not just survival, but triumph. Not just hope, but fulfillment. From her special seat in the front row, her daughter beamed with pride, clutching her teddy bear and paper heart. The producer stood at the back of the hall, remembering that cold night when he'd first heard her voice through his car window. Sometimes the best music, he thought, comes from those who have known both struggle and joy, both loss and love. As her voice filled the concert hall, she sang for everyone who had ever needed a second chance, for every parent fighting for their child, for every dream that seemed impossible. But mostly, she sang for the woman she had been 3 months ago, standing on a cold street corner, not knowing that everything was about to change. Because sometimes, when life seems darkest, all it takes is one person willing to stop and listen to your song.